He never begged, never spoke, just slept beside the same grave for 15 years. Most walked past him. Keanu didn't. What he discovered wasn't just a man broken by loss. It was a truth buried deep and a promise no one else had kept. And when the truth surfaced, the world finally listened. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The cemetery wasn't part of the plan. Keanu had finished reviewing a nearby church as a potential scene location for a historical drama. The production assistant suggested taking a shortcut through the old graveyard to avoid the traffic on the main road. It was unassuming, small, fenced in by wrought iron, the kind of place you'd miss unless you were looking for it. That was when Keanu saw him. The man lay curled at the base of a weathered gravestone, his back pressed gently against the stone like he belonged there. His coat was faded denim, frayed at the cuffs, with patches sewn in by hand. His hands were tucked beneath his arms, his knees drawn close to his chest. He wasn't sleeping like someone passing time. He was sleeping like someone holding on. No cardboard sign, no cup for change, just a man, a grave, and the silence between them. Keanu slowed down. Something about the image stopped him. The light was soft, drifting through the oaks above like a curtain, pulling back on something sacred. He didn't speak. He didn't move closer. He just looked. Then, from behind him, a quiet voice said, "He's always there. Doesn't bother anyone." Keanu turned. An older man with a salt and pepper beard stood holding hedge clippers and a rusted tin of rose fertilizer. The name tag on his shirt read, "Walt." Keanu nodded toward the figure near the stone. "How long has he been here?" Walt adjusted his cap. "About 15 years, maybe more. Comes at dusk. Leaves sometimes in the morning, sometimes not at all. Never asks for anything, just sits there, or lies down like that. Does anyone know who he is?" Walt shrugged. "Some folks say he's a vet. Others think he's just one of those ghosts that never left." Keanu studied the grave. It was clean. No overgrown weeds, no debris. Fresh violets bloomed around its base. Someone had been tending to it. "What's the name on the stone?" "Elena Marie Thornton," Walt replied. "Passed away in '97. Was she his wife?" Walt leaned on the fence post. "Never asked. He don't talk much." Keanu nodded, but his eyes never left the man by the stone. A breeze moved through the cemetery, gentle and cool. The man stirred slightly, but didn't wake. His face was lean, aged beyond the years his hair suggested. There was something weathered about him. Not broken, just worn, like leather stretched thin over time. Keanu looked one more time, then gave Walt a polite nod and walked back toward the van waiting by the gate. He didn't say a word the whole drive back to set, but something stayed with him. It wasn't just the grave, or the man, it was the quiet between them. Like a secret neither had ever spoken aloud. That night, Keanu lay awake longer than usual. He wasn't rehearsing lines. He wasn't thinking about the next scene or memorizing blocking. Instead, he was back in that cemetery, his mind retracing the cracks in the old headstone, the silence of the man beside it, the stillness that didn't feel like despair, but something else. Devotion, maybe. It was hard to explain. He'd seen homelessness before. It wasn't new to him. He'd walked through cities where entire camps lined the sidewalks. But this was different. This man wasn't there to be seen. He wasn't asking for help. He wasn't shouting into the void. He was simply keeping vigil. By morning, Keanu couldn't shake the image. Between takes on set, he found himself distracted. When the director asked him a question about a scene's emotional tone, Keanu responded, "It's about staying with something, even after it's gone." Nobody knew what he meant. Later that day, during a break, he quietly asked Sophia, his longtime assistant, if she had time to look into something. "What's the name again?" she asked, phone already in hand. "Elena Marie Thornton," he said. buried at Brookvale Cemetery, died in 1997. Sophia nodded, typing it into a public records site. Any idea who the man might be? Not yet. He paused, then added, but I think he's still there. By dusk, Keanu was back at the cemetery. This time, he came alone. The gate creaked open, the air smelled of earth and rusted iron. Evening shadows stretched long across the stones. And there, just as before, was the man. Seated now, not lying down. Legs crossed, coat pulled tight, hands folded neatly in his lap. He didn't look up when Keanu approached. His gaze was fixed on the gravestone, his posture reverent. Keanu didn't speak right away. He simply sat down on the opposite end of the grave, not facing the man but matching his stillness. The minutes passed. Eventually the man spoke. His voice was low, gravel-lined, but calm. "You back again?" Keanu glanced over. "Yeah. I couldn't stop thinking about this place." The man gave a slight nod. "Not many people do." Keanu hesitated, then said gently, "Was she your wife?" The man's lips tightened slightly, but he nodded. "She was." There was a pause. "Arthur," he said. "My name." Keanu reached out, not with formality, just honesty. "Keanu." Arthur shook it briefly, then turned back toward the stone. Keanu followed his gaze. The grave looked almost soft in the amber light, the stone carved with a simplicity that made it feel sacred. "You've been here a long time," Keanu said. Arthur didn't answer. He didn't have to. Keanu sat beside Arthur for a while, unsure what to say next. There was a sacredness in the quiet, a rhythm not to be broken by questions. The world beyond the cemetery gates kept moving, but here it felt like everything had stopped years ago and simply never restarted. Eventually, Keanu asked, "How long have you been coming here?" Arthur didn't turn his head. He looked at the grave like it still breathed. 15 years, he said. Keanu felt something shift in his chest. "Every night?" Arthur nodded once. "Missed two. A hospital stay." "That's it?" Keanu didn't press. He didn't ask why. "Not yet." Arthur glanced over at him and then said, "People think grief is loud. They think it screams, begs. But it doesn't. It waits." Keanu met his eyes for the first time. They weren't broken. They were heavy, like they'd carried too much for too long and still chose to keep going. "She deserved better," Arthur said. "So this is the least I can do." Keanu wanted to ask what had happened, how she died, why no one seemed to be there but him. But something held him back. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was the feeling that the truth had a time of its own. A distant train rumbled in the background, the only sound besides the wind shifting leaves across the dirt. Arthur stood slowly. He stretched, then reached down to brush debris from the grave. With surprising care, he placed a folded piece of cloth at the base. It looked like a handkerchief, worn but clean. "She always liked lavender," he murmured, said it made the world feel soft. Keanu rose too, watching silently. Arthur turned to him. "Why'd you come back?" Keanu paused. "Because it felt like something wasn't finished." Arthur gave a faint smile, one without humor, just understanding. "Then you felt it right." They didn't shake hands this time. They didn't need to. As Arthur walked away, his coat rustling in the wind, Keanu remained by the grave a moment longer. He read the name again. Helena Marie Thornton. No birth year, no epitaph, just her name and a single line beneath. "My always." Keanu reached into his pocket, pulled out the small notebook he often carried during film shoots, and jotted one sentence. "Some people don't leave because love never did." Then he closed the book, tucked it away, and walked out of the cemetery as the sun slipped behind the trees, carrying with him a story he hadn't yet heard, but already knew mattered. Keanu came back early the next morning. The sun had just risen, and the grass still wore the silver sheen of dawn. He moved quietly through the iron gate, not wanting to startle anyone, not even the birds perched along the crooked fence posts. There was something about this cemetery that slowed his steps, quieted his breath, like it asked you to respect what lingered here. He found the grave again with little effort. The stone stood simple and solitary. No vase, no marble sculpture, just gray granite, weathered by time. The same cloth Arthur had left still rested at its base, a sprig of lavender tucked into the corner, like someone had remembered her favorite scent after all these years. Keanu crouched down and brushed away a few dried leaves that had blown across the lettering. Elena Marie Thronton. My always. He read the line over and over again. There were no dates, no quotes from scripture, no surname for Arthur, just that name, and a phrase that told the entire story in 2 words. My always. He whispered it once under his breath. It sounded like something between a vow and a farewell. A soft shuffle behind him made him turn. Arthur was there. He wasn't carrying anything. He didn't look startled. If anything, he looked like a man who'd expected this visit. You're back, he said, voice even. Keanu stood slowly. Couldn't stop thinking about her. Arthur gave a slight nod. Most people forget fast. Keanu looked at him closely. Arthur's eyes were clear but tired. He hadn't shaved. His hair, streaked with silver, was combed back loosely, but there was a stillness about him, like a man not waiting for anything, just existing beside what he lost. Keanu took a breath. I hope it's not intrusive, but I wanted to ask about her. Arthur didn't answer right away. He looked at the stone, then at the trees above, their bare branches etched against the sky like veins. She was kind, Arthur said finally, the kind that didn't need to talk loud to be heard. Keanu waited. She taught piano, loved rainy mornings, made coffee too strong and smiled like it was a secret. There was silence between them again, but this time it wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Arthur continued. People ask me why I come here, why I stay, but they don't ask what it meant to have someone like her, or what it cost to wake up without her. Keanu's voice was soft. You were married a long time. Arthur looked down at the stone. Not long enough. Keanu nodded. I read the words, my always. Was that something she said? Arthur shook his head. It's what I said, every night before we fell asleep. Arthur sat down beside the grave as though he'd done it 1,000 times, which he had. He didn't look at Keanu, didn't seem to expect him to sit, but Keanu lowered himself anyway, resting on the edge of a nearby stone bench. He didn't want to push too hard, but something inside told him this story had never been told, not fully, not to someone willing to stay long enough to hear it. How did she die? Keanu asked gently. Arthur's fingers tapped against his knee for a moment. Then he answered, voice hollow but steady. Hit and run. She'd just picked up dinner for us, was walking back. Crosswalk wasn't marked well. Car sped through the light. Keanu closed his eyes for a second. I'm sorry. Arthur nodded. So was I. So were the cops. So was the whole damn town, until they decided someone had to be blamed. There was something sharp under those words, but not rage. It was quieter than that. Resigned. Annie said I was drunk, that I'd let her walk alone because I was angry. Arthur looked out over the cemetery lawn. We never even fought. Not once that day. But people don't care about the truth when they're scared. Keanu turned to him. There was a case? Arthur gave a dry laugh. Sort of. Investigation lasted 2 weeks. No witnesses stepped forward, except one. Said they heard yelling, saw a man storm away from her just before the accident. They described a jacket like mine. Keanu's brow furrowed. But you weren't the driver. I was the one holding her when they found us. The words landed like a punch. Arthur leaned back against the tree behind them. I wasn't allowed to bury her in a public cemetery at first. Had to fight for this spot. No funeral, no service, just me and the stone. Keanu looked at the grave again, that single name carved into stone, as if the world had tried to erase everything else. No obituary, no flowers. Just this man, night after night, carrying something no one else had stayed long enough to witness. "Why didn't you leave?" Keanu asked. Arthur looked at him, eyes more alive than before. "Because she deserved someone who stayed." The answer was simple, but it shook Keanu more than anything. In a world that moved on without asking why, here was a man who refused to. Keanu sat still, watching Arthur's hands rest on his knees, calloused and creased like old leather. These weren't the hands of someone asking for sympathy. They were hands that had weathered storms, buried dreams, and still chose to carry memory like something sacred. "You never tried to clear your name?" Keanu asked quietly. Arthur looked over with a tired half-smile. "You ever try yelling into a storm?" That's what it felt like. By the time I realized they weren't going to look further, it was already too late. Elena was gone. The noise around me died down, but the silence stayed. Keanu took a breath. "What about family, friends, anyone who stood up for you?" "Family's gone. We didn't have kids." Her brother blamed me. I didn't argue. Figured if that helped him sleep, let him have it. Keanu nodded slowly, thoughts already racing. The name of the brother, the witness who claimed to see the fight, the police who closed the case in 2 weeks. It was too neat, too quiet. Arthur shifted a little, rubbing his thumb across the edge of the gravestone like he was tracing her name through memory. "I didn't come here for pity," he said. "I don't want a spotlight or a second chance. I come because this is where she is, and until I go, that's enough." Keanu looked around the cemetery. It wasn't grand. It wasn't even well kept outside the plot Arthur tended, but there was something in the air, like time bent here, like this place held a breath no one else noticed. "She deserved better," Arthur said. "So do you," Keanu replied. Arthur didn't speak. He just nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, being heard mattered after all. They sat for a while longer, watching the sky shift from pale morning blue to something deeper. A bird landed briefly on the edge of the headstone and then fluttered off again. Life kept moving, even here. Eventually, Keanu stood. "I'll see you again." Arthur didn't ask why. He didn't question what Keanu would do with what he'd learned. He just looked up and said, "Take your time, but if you come back, bring lavender." Keanu smiled. He walked away with more than he came with. He walked away with a story no one had finished writing. And as the gate clicked shut behind him, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just grief. It was injustice buried with love. And it was time someone dug it back up. Keanu returned the next morning with 2 coffees in hand. The sky was low and gray, promising rain but never quite delivering it. He walked the same winding path through Brookvale Cemetery, the gate creaking behind him like a door closing on a world that had long since quieted. Arthur was already there, as if he hadn't moved. He sat cross-legged beside Elena's grave, the same worn coat around his shoulders. His eyes were open, but his posture was somewhere between prayer and stillness. Keanu approached and held out the cup. Arthur took it without a word, nodding once before blowing into the lid and taking a sip. "Black, no sugar," Keanu said. Arthur cracked the smallest smile. "Old habit." They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the wind stir the ivy along the stone wall behind them. Keanu didn't rush the moment. He knew by now that Arthur spoke when the words were ready, and not a second before. "You said you served," Keanu finally asked. Arthur gave a slow nod. "U.S. Marines, 12 years. Where were you stationed?" "Beirut, Kosovo, Okinawa for a stretch. Met Elena in Germany." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "She was stationed?" Arthur smiled again, this time with something softer behind it. "Army nurse. She patched up half the guys who came through that field hospital. First time I saw her, she was arguing with a colonel twice her size about a missing box of antibiotics." "And one?" Keanu asked. Didn't even raise her voice. She just stared at him till he turned red and walked out. They both chuckled. Arthur's face turned quiet again. She saved people before she ever saved me. I was the lucky one." Keanu waited, sipping his coffee. Arthur continued. "When our tours ended, we came back to the States. Got married in a courthouse in Virginia. No guests. Just us and 2 friends from base. Simple. Quiet. That's how she liked things." Keanu leaned in a little. "Did you have a life here in town?" Arthur nodded slowly. "We bought a small house on the west side. She started teaching nursing at a community college. I did carpentry, built decks, fences, nothing fancy. But we were happy." The word hung there like something sacred. Then came the shift in his tone. "And then one night," Arthur said, voice tightening, "it all stopped." He didn't need to say more. Not yet. Keanu felt the weight behind those words, the kind that held more pain in silence than explanation ever could. "What happened that night?" Keanu asked gently. Arthur looked at the grave. "She died. And I disappeared." Arthur didn't speak for a while after that. He just stared down into his cup, the steam now gone, his fingers gripping it more for warmth than comfort. Keanu didn't move. He'd learned something important about Arthur already. When the silence stretched, it was never empty. It was filling with the courage to speak. "I'd just finished fixing the back fence," Arthur said. "She wanted Indian food that night, from this place 2 blocks over. I told her I'd go pick it up, but she said no, wanted to stretch her legs." He let out a breath. "I should have gone. That's the part that never leaves. She said she'd be back in 15. I sat on the porch, was halfway through a glass of water when I heard the tires scream." Keanu looked over at him, his jaw tight. "I ran. Didn't even put on shoes. Found her lying half in, half out of the crosswalk. The food was still in her hands." Arthur closed his eyes. "I thought she was breathing. I told myself she was breathing. But she was already gone." He reached down and touched the stone beside him, fingers brushing over Elena's name, like he needed to keep her close, through touch alone. Cops showed up fast. So did the crowd. Some lady, never got her name, said she'd seen a man in a dark coat walking away from her right before it happened. She pointed at me, said I matched the jacket. Keanu's fists clenched slightly, but he stayed still. "He found a flask in the gutter, swore it had been mine. Wasn't. I hadn't touched a drink in 4 years by then. But that didn't matter." "Did they charge you?" Keanu asked. Arthur shook his head. "No trial, no conviction, just whispers. Her brother stopped returning my calls. Her friends cut off contact. My landlord gave me notice. I started getting followed, watched, everywhere I went." His voice dropped lower. "Soon, I wasn't part of the town anymore. I was just the guy who walked away from the woman everyone loved." Keanu looked around the cemetery. "And so, you came here?" Arthur nodded. "It was the only place I could be near her without someone spitting on the ground beside me." Keanu felt something stir deep in his chest. It wasn't just sorrow. It was anger. The kind born when decency gets buried under assumptions. "She was your whole life," he said quietly. Arthur's eyes didn't waver. "She still is." Keanu sat forward, elbows on his knees, gaze fixed on the ground, as if trying to piece together something fractured but still whole underneath. "Arthur," he said, "did anyone ever investigate beyond that first report?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He stared at the grave, and when he finally spoke, his voice was tired. "They filed it away. Said it was inconclusive, called me a person of interest, and then let it die quietly. But that kind of accusation doesn't need evidence, just echo." Keanu pressed gently. "Was there a camera nearby? Traffic light?" Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly, like the idea had once come and gone. "There was a bank on the corner. Don't know if it had cameras then. I didn't ask. I didn't have anyone to ask for me." Keanu nodded slowly, gears already turning in his mind. "What about her family?" Arthur's expression darkened. "Her brother, Andrew, worked for the city, used to be close with Elena. He blamed me. Never said it outright, but he stopped returning my calls the night after the funeral. Told people I had a temper. Keanu tilted his head. Did you? Arthur let out a bitter chuckle. Only when someone lied. Guess that didn't help. Keanu studied him again, not just his words, but the posture of a man who'd carried judgment like it was a second spine. There was something about Arthur that didn't read as defeated. He didn't ask for sympathy. He wasn't angry at the world. He was just still, rooted in love, like a tree that refused to fall even after the storm took everything. I don't think you're lying, Keanu said quietly. Arthur didn't flinch. I know. Keanu stood, brushing dust from his jeans. Would you be okay if I asked some questions, checked a few things? Arthur looked up, eyes a little sharper now. Why? Keanu's voice didn't waver. Because silence isn't justice, and your love deserves more than a rumor. Arthur took a deep breath. She believed in fixing things, said every break had a place to heal if someone cared enough to look. Keanu smiled softly. Then, maybe it's time we start looking. He walked away slowly, the sky above them still muted but beginning to shift. Behind him, Arthur remained by the grave, unchanged on the outside. But something in the air felt different. For the first time in 15 years, a war that had stayed silent might finally begin to be heard. Back at his house, Keanu poured 2 mugs of strong coffee and slid one across the table to Sophia, who had already opened her laptop. A few thick files were spread across the dining table, the kind that smelled faintly like cardboard and time. Old court records, public archives, newspaper clippings no one had clicked in decades. He brought her up to speed, voice low and steady. His name's Arthur Thornton, former Marine, lived here with his wife, Elena. She was hit by a car walking home with dinner. They blamed him. No charges, no trial, just whispers. Sophia scrolled as she listened. You sure about that? He's been sleeping next to her grave every night for 15 years. Doesn't ask for anything, doesn't shout, just... She paused and looked up. What are we looking for? Something they didn't, Keanu said. A reason the world decided to forget him. They started with the court docket. Elena Marie Thornton. Died July 16, 1997. Cause of death, vehicular trauma, hit and run. Keanu leaned in as Sophia read aloud the summary from the inquest. Initial suspect spouse, no eyewitness video. One statement from neighbor citing possible domestic tension. Statement later contradicted by 2 other neighbors. Who gave the statement? Keanu asked. Sophia clicked into it. Name redacted in this version, but there's a supplemental file. She opened another tab. It took a minute, but then it popped up. Connolly. Keanu frowned. Arthur said Elena's brother was named Andrew. Could be coincidence. Or not, Sophia murmured. She kept reading. 2 witnesses. One said Arthur stormed off the porch after an argument. Another said the 2 of them were laughing over coffee 10 minutes before the accident. Contradiction, Keanu said. And no camera footage? None logged. But back then, most small banks didn't keep digital archives. Keanu ran a hand over his jaw, thinking. Her death was ruled undetermined. That gave the police enough to step back, quietly, but not enough for anyone to prove innocence. Sophia flipped to the next page and froze. Look at this, she said. She pointed to a line in the file. Subject Arthur Thornton declined further inquiry. No formal defense submitted. Keanu stared at it. Els didn't defend himself. Sophia nodded. It's like he gave up before it even started. Keanu exhaled slowly. No, not gave up. Protected something. Sophia tilted her head. You think he was covering for someone? Keanu didn't answer right away, but something in his eyes said yes. And whatever it was, whoever it was, had stayed hidden for far too long. Sophia pulled up the city directory, her fingers tapping quickly over the keys. She narrowed the timeline to the year of Elena's death and filtered for any public employment records with the name Andrew Connolly. There, she said, pointing to the screen. Andrew Connolly, public safety liaison, Department of Community Affairs. Keanu leaned in. That's not just a city worker. That's someone with access to departments, friends in precincts, influence. Sophia nodded, and if he gave that initial statement under a different surname, knew how to stay close without being seen. They sat back for a moment, the hum of the laptop fan filling the pause. Keanu tapped the table. What if the witness who pointed the finger wasn't just mistaken? You think he framed Arthur? Maybe not in the courtroom sense, Keanu said. But in the public one? Yeah. He said Arthur had a temper. No one else backed that up. Sophia clicked open a few archived neighborhood association bulletins. Here's something weird. Right after Elena's death, Andrew launched a pedestrian safety task force for the city. He held a press conference about crosswalks and lighting upgrades. Keanu tilted his head. A campaign built on a tragedy. Sophia gave a tight smile. And the more public he got, the more invisible Arthur became. They kept reading. Multiple reports of city funding directed to community safety workshops chaired by Andrew Connolly. His public approval spiked. Within 2 years, he'd been appointed Deputy Director of Civic Planning. Hell turned her death into a ladder, Keanu said. Sophia sat back. You know what this smells like? A story rewritten, Keanu replied, by someone who wanted to erase the man who knew the truth. Keanu stood and began pacing the room. Arthur never said a word against him, not once. Even when I asked about Elena's family, he just said, her brother blamed me. That's all. Sophia looked up. That's restraint. No, Keanu said. That's loyalty. To her. He didn't want to ruin what she loved, even if it meant he had to take the blame. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of what they were uncovering settling over the table like dust on old memories. Finally, Sophia asked, So what do we do? Keanu's voice was steady. We finish what no one else started. The next day, Keanu made a call. He reached out to someone he hadn't spoken to in years, a former journalist turned legal archivist named Erin Tolan. She'd covered small-town corruption for decades before retiring quietly into research work. She answered on the second ring. I was wondering when you'd call, she said, voice dry with age but alert. You've got that tone, the one people get when they find a hole and wonder what fell through it. Keanu smiled faintly. I'm looking into a case from 1997. Elena Thornton. Hit and run, no resolution. Her husband was blamed but never charged. Rokevale? Erin asked. I remember whispers, but nothing official ever came across my desk. I'm trying to find out if there was a camera, a bank on the corner. You're lucky, she said. I helped archive the city's traffic camera transition records. Give me a few hours. Keanu hung up and paced. Sophia was already on her phone, tracking down the local precinct's former shift supervisor. She finally looked up. Retired 5 years ago, lives in Idaho now, but he remembered something strange. What? There was a tape, the bank had one. It was logged into evidence, then pulled. Keanu blinked. Pulled? Within 48 hours, by request from a city official. Keanu already knew the name. Andrew. Sophia nodded. It was logged but never filed, disappeared before they closed the inquiry. An hour later, Erin called back. There's a backup, she said. Old VHS archive, mislabeled. If it's what I think it is, it's in a warehouse in Long Beach. Keanu didn't hesitate. He left that evening. The storage facility sat like a forgotten kingdom of dust and paper. Erin had arranged everything. One archivist, a flashlight, and a box marked 1997, transit/MISC. Inside were 3 tapes. Keanu took them back to his house and borrowed an old VCR from a neighbor. The static cleared and the grainy footage played. It showed the intersection, nighttime, empty streets. Then, Elena, walking slowly, a takeout bag in one hand. Then a car speeding through, a blur. She stepped forward, paused, then turned back. And in that pause, another figure. Not Arthur. Someone in a city-issued jacket, standing near the light pole, watching, then disappearing down the side alley. Keanu froze the frame. The face wasn't clear, but the posture, the frame, even the short haircut. It matched the city headshots he'd seen of Andrew Connolly. He sat back, breath caught in his throat. Arthur hadn't just been innocent. He had been silenced. Keanu waited on the weathered porch of a brick duplex tucked into a quiet corner of Riverside. The garden was overgrown, ivy twisting up the railing like it was trying to erase the years that had passed unnoticed. The mailbox still bore a rusted placard, T. Connolly. He hadn't come alone. Sophia waited in the car down the street, ready in case things turned hostile. But Keanu had a different sense. This wasn't going to be about confrontation. It was going to be about confession. The door opened. A tall, lean man in his late 50s stood there, face gaunt but familiar. His hair had thinned, and his eyes were wary, sharp with the kind of caution born not of fear, but guilt. "Thomas Connolly?" Keanu asked. The man's jaw tensed. "Depends who's asking." Keanu extended a hand. "My name's Keanu. I'd like to talk to you about your sister, Elena." The man's shoulders slumped slightly at the name, like something collapsed inside him. "You should come in." They stepped into a narrow hallway lined with old family photos and military plaques. A single faded portrait of Elena sat on the mantel, almost hidden behind a vase of dead flowers. Keanu sat on the edge of the couch. "I've been speaking with Arthur." Thomas froze mid-step. "Arthur's still alive?" Keanu nodded. "He's never left her. Not once." Thomas didn't move for a while. Then he slowly lowered himself into the chair across from Keanu and ran a hand through his thinning hair. I always figured he'd disappear. That's what everyone said he did." "B and Keanu," said softly. "He stayed." Thomas exhaled deeply. "And I was the one who made sure nobody believed him." The admission came with no resistance, no excuse, just a raw, heavy truth that had clearly waited years to surface. "I need you to tell me why," Keanu said gently. Thomas looked down at his hands. "Because I didn't like him. Simple as that. He wasn't polished, didn't come from money. And Elena, she was everything to me. After our parents died, I thought I was the only one who really looked out for her. I thought I knew what was best." Keanu listened in silence. "When they got married, I didn't even show up. I told people I was busy, but really I just didn't want her picking someone who didn't come through me first. So when the accident happened, I didn't lie. But I didn't tell the truth either." Keanu leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, careful not to interrupt the silence that followed. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on the room, the kind of silence that doesn't settle by accident, but by years of holding something in too long. Thomas stared at the floor. "She called me the morning she died." Keanu didn't speak. He let it come naturally. "She said they were doing fine, that she was picking up food and wanted to swing by and talk after dinner. I told her I was busy, that I had a city meeting. Truth is, I wasn't. I just didn't want to hear about him, about their life." His voice cracked slightly. "When the news came out that night, I panicked. The police asked if I'd seen anything strange. I told them I'd driven by and thought I saw Arthur walking down the block earlier, looked upset. I didn't think they'd take it seriously. But they did," Keanu said quietly. Thomas nodded. "They took my word like it was gospel. And once that boulder started rolling, I didn't know how to stop it without crushing myself." Keanu let that sit. "You knew the tape existed, didn't you?" he asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. "I requested it be pulled, said it was sensitive, claimed it could compromise a city official's identity. The truth is, I didn't want it to show what it would, that Arthur wasn't near the scene, that I was wrong." Keanu's jaw tightened. "So you let them bury it?" Thomas looked up, eyes red. "I didn't think he'd survive the smear. But I also didn't think he'd survive if I suddenly changed my story. I told myself I was protecting the family's name, But really, I was protecting my pride. The words fell with finality. Keanu sat back, letting the full weight of it sink in. For both of them. I have a tape, Keanu said softly. It shows the truth. I'm going public with it. Thomas blinked, then nodded slowly. Good. He deserves that. I need your voice, Keanu continued, to help clear his name, not just in court, but in the eyes of everyone who walked past him without seeing. Thomas rubbed his palms together, the tremor in his fingers barely visible. If I do this, he said, people will ask why I waited so long. They will, Keanu replied, but they'll also hear what you say now, and so will Arthur. Thomas looked over at the photo of Elena. Then let's give her the truth. The following morning, Keanu arranged for a quiet meeting between Thomas and Sophia in the back room of a local legal advocacy group. No cameras, no press, just a voice recorder, a few signed consent forms, and a man finally ready to speak without hiding. Thomas sat at the small wooden table, hands folded, waiting for Sophia to begin. His face was tight, but resolved. She turned on the device and nodded gently. When you're ready. Thomas cleared his throat, then began. My name is Thomas Connolly. 26 years ago, I made a statement to police about my sister Elena Thornton's death. That statement was misleading. It suggested her husband Arthur Thornton was near the scene and emotionally unstable. I now admit that was not the truth. His voice didn't shake, but his eyes began to glisten. I was angry. I didn't like their marriage. I let my feelings speak instead of facts. I never saw Arthur near the scene, and I later used my position to suppress a traffic video that showed someone else nearby. I did it to protect my career, and in doing so, I destroyed his. The room was still. Thomas looked up at Keanu. I'm not proud of who I was, but I'd like to help fix what I can. Sophia clicked the recorder off. That's enough for an official affidavit, she said. We'll file it with the city archive and the state's ethics board. We'll also be issuing a press release, if you're willing. Thomas nodded. I'll read it, but I'll sign whatever needs signing. Outside, the clouds had parted. Keanu stepped onto the sidewalk with Thomas, the sun catching on the metal edges of a newspaper rack nearby. He looked at the man who had once buried a truth to protect his pride. You did the right thing today, Keanu said. Thomas squinted into the light. A little late, maybe, but not too late. They parted ways a few minutes later. Keanu stood alone on the sidewalk for a while, then reached for his phone. He called Arthur. It rang twice. Hello? Keanu smiled. It's time. Arthur didn't ask what he meant. He just said, okay. And as Keanu looked toward the direction of the cemetery, he knew what had been silent for so long was finally ready to be spoken. This wasn't just about clearing a name. It was about returning a man's place in the story that had always been his. Keanu sat in his study late into the night, the room quiet but not empty. The weight of Arthur's story still hung in the air, raw, unfiltered, and too sacred to cheapen with headlines or sound bites. On the desk in front of him sat the VHS tape, the signed affidavit from Thomas, and a printout of the court file that had started it all. But tonight wasn't about paperwork or evidence. It was about something deeper. He opened his laptop and stared at the blinking cursor for a long moment. Then, slowly, he began to type, not as an actor, not as a public figure, but as someone who had witnessed the quiet persistence of truth. He didn't use names. He didn't say Marine, widower, or homeless. He just told the truth in its simplest form. Once, there was a man who lost everything, not because he failed, but because someone else did, and no one stopped it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to clear his name. He just stayed. Every night, beside the one person who'd loved him without condition. For 15 years he waited, not for justice, but for peace, for someone to remember what silence had buried. He paused, reading it aloud under his breath. The words felt right, unpolished, true. Then he added a question beneath the story. Have you ever been wrongly judged or lost someone because the truth came too late? Share your story below. He hit post, and then he walked away. By the next morning, Sophia had already texted, "You need to look." Keanu sat back at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, opened his phone, and pulled up the post. It had gone viral overnight. More than 250,000 shares. Thousands of comments. But it wasn't the numbers that struck him. It was the way people responded, as if a collective wound had been given space to breathe. A woman from Ohio wrote, "My brother died in jail before they proved he didn't do it. No trial. Just shame. Thank you for telling this story." A nurse in Phoenix shared, "I lost my job after a false report. No one asked for my side. It took me 3 years to recover. I still haven't recovered all of me." A veteran in Florida wrote, "They told me to man up and get over it, but I wasn't broken, I was grieving. This man you wrote about? I know him. I am him." Keanu read every one. They weren't just stories. They were pieces of people, handed over, gently, to someone they hoped would understand. And Keanu did, because he knew the man who waited by a grave. It started 2 days after the post. At first, the groundskeeper thought it was a coincidence. A young couple wandered through the cemetery gates just before sunset, holding hands. They paused by the grave where Arthur sat with his back to the wind, wrapped in that same worn coat, his head lowered. The couple didn't say much. They just stood a few feet away, quietly reading the headstone. Elena Mary Thornton, my always. Then the woman knelt, placed a small flower beside the stone, and whispered something no one could hear. Arthur looked up. She nodded, that was all. By the next morning there were 3 bouquets, placed with care, not fanfare. A folded note rested between them. Arthur picked it up with trembling fingers. "You remind me of my grandfather. He never stopped waiting either. He passed before anyone knew the truth. I just wanted to say thank you." By the end of the week, they came in steady trickles. A man in army fatigues with tears in his eyes. A group of high school students on a service project who asked the groundskeeper if they could clean the path leading to her grave. A woman who brought a folding chair and sat in silence across from Arthur for over an hour. When she finally spoke, she said, "I lost someone too, but I ran. You didn't." The cemetery, once empty by dusk, now held a quiet chorus of footsteps. People didn't crowd Arthur. They didn't take pictures or ask for interviews. They just showed up, not for spectacle, for solidarity. They brought drawings, candles, handwritten poems, and more notes. Some were addressed to Arthur, others simply to the one who stayed. Keanu visited quietly one evening, parking a block away. He didn't speak to Arthur that night. He didn't need to. Instead, he sat on a bench just outside the circle of light from the nearby lamppost and watched as an elderly man placed a medal at the base of the gravestone. No explanation, no fanfare, just the gentle clink of metal against stone. That night, Keanu opened his notebook and wrote a single line. The world often forgets the ones who never leave, but sometimes when you tell the truth, the world starts to remember. The next wave didn't come from a viral boost or another trending share. It came from a reporter named Clara Mendoza. She wasn't looking for a headline. She was writing a column for the Sunday edition of the Pasadena Sentinel, a piece called Echoes of Us, where she highlighted overlooked stories of dignity and endurance. She approached Keanu respectfully, asking if he'd be willing to confirm what was already emerging online. He hesitated. Then, slowly, he handed her a copy of the affidavit. "Use it. But don't make him a victim," he said. "Make him a man who stayed." Clara nodded. And she did. The article was simple, no frills, no sensationalism, just a quiet profile titled, "Arthur Thornton, the Man Who Waited Beside Love." It included a timeline of what happened. Elena's life as a nurse, Arthur's military service, the hit and run, the blame, the silence, and finally, the apology from her brother that helped set the record straight. The article ended with a line that stayed with readers. In a world that moved on without him, Arthur never moved from her. That Sunday, something shifted. The mayor's office issued a formal apology. A local veterans group announced plans to award Arthur a citation of honor for unwavering loyalty in both service and memory. Even the cemetery, normally strict on policy, allowed a special plaque to be installed beside the gravestone. Beloved wife, remembered husband, loyalty never leaves. Arthur didn't say much about it. But the next morning, a caretaker found a single folding chair placed beside the grave. On the seat was a thermos of coffee, a book of poetry, and a note. For the mornings she would have wanted to share. And for the first time since the grave had been marked, Arthur wasn't alone. Not just in presence, but in public memory. Keanu read the article again later that night, alone in his kitchen. He turned the last page and smiled faintly. This wasn't justice in a courtroom. It wasn't redemption through spectacle. It was something gentler. It was the return of a man's name, spoken not with suspicion, but with respect. And sometimes, Keanu thought, that's all anyone really wants. To be known not for the day the world turned away, but for the years they never stopped waiting. The email arrived late one evening with the subject line, "You don't know me, but I knew her." Keanu opened it slowly. The sender identified herself as Joan Fessler, a retired investigative reporter who once worked for the San Gabriel Tribune. Her message was short, direct, and weighted. "I covered the Thornton case in 1997. I never believed the official report. There's something I need to show you. Please call me." Attached was an old scan, barely legible, of a memo she had submitted to her editor at the time. It outlined a theory that the car involved in the hit and run belonged to the son of a prominent city councilman. Witnesses had seen the car driving erratically just minutes before the crash. But the next day, the vehicle disappeared from the impound list, and all leads suddenly went cold. Keanu stared at the file, heart tightening. The name of the councilman's son had been redacted, but Joan had underlined one sentence in red. "The victim's husband has been blamed, but no one is asking who had the power to vanish the truth." He picked up the phone and dialed the number in the signature. Joan answered on the second ring. "You got it, didn't you?" she asked without preamble. "Yes," Keanu replied. "How much of this was true?" "All of it. I had 3 sources, 2 anonymous, 1 internal. But the paper killed the story, said it wasn't substantiated. What they meant was it was too dangerous." "Do you still have the original?" There was a pause on the line. "I do. I kept a printed draft hidden in my attic. I never stopped thinking about it." Keanu's voice dropped. "Can you meet me?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." They met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Pasadena, the kind of place where people ordered without looking at the menu. Joan Fessler arrived first, a tall woman with short silver hair and a trench coat that looked like it had seen every storm of the last 30 years. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. From her satchel, she pulled out a manila folder, yellowed with age. She slid it across the table. "The draft that never saw daylight," she said. Keanu opened it gently. The first page was a typed article titled, "Councilman's Son Linked to Fatal Crash. Sources Claim Suppression." Beneath it, Joan's byline. The article laid out the full picture. A witness who described the car, the matching plates from a parking ticket 2 hours before the crash, and the councilman's influence over both the police precinct and the city's press board. "What happened to the witness?" Keanu asked. "Transferred jobs. Out of state, then stopped returning calls. My internal source was reassigned within a week. No one had the stomach to push it further." Keanu scanned the last paragraph. It was a question, not a conclusion. If the husband was guilty, why did the story shift so fast? And if he wasn't, what was it we were told to forget? He looked up. "Why now?" Joan folded her hands around her coffee. "Because I'm not dying with this in a box. And because someone like you might have a chance to make it right." Later that day, they walked into the San Gabriel Tribune headquarters together. The office was smaller now, post-digital age, a few rows of cubicles, fluorescent lighting, and the scent of paper that never quite left. Joan marched up to the editor-in-chief's door. A man named Rick Baines greeted them, clearly unsettled to see her again. "I've got something to show you," Joan said calmly, holding up the draft. He sighed. "Joan, that story was over 20 years ago. And it was buried," she cut in, "because someone in this room folded under pressure. But now the husband's name is being cleared. Don't you think our readers deserve to know why it was dirty in the first place?" Rick looked between her and Keanu, then gestured toward his office. "Close the door." For the next 20 minutes, Joan laid it all out. Her original sources, the paper's internal emails, the phone calls that killed the piece. Rick didn't argue. He didn't deny. He just nodded. "I'll authorize a reprint," he said quietly. "Full context, and an apology." Keanu stood. Not for credit, for truth. The following Sunday, the San Gabriel Tribune carried a front-page feature that hadn't been seen in over 2 decades. The headline read, "The story that was silenced, how one man was blamed while power protected the truth." Joan's full article was reprinted. Original quotes, timelines, and the damning evidence of political suppression. But this time, the piece didn't end with a question. It ended with a name. Arthur Thornton, and a photograph of him, taken just 2 days before, seated beside Elena's grave, wearing the same weathered coat, eyes closed in stillness. The response was swift. Readers called in, veterans left voicemails. Emails poured into the editorial inbox. And then, without warning, a wave of donations began arriving. Small checks, handwritten notes, messages like, "This won't bring back time, but I hope it buys you peace." From someone who also waited too long to be believed. "Thank you for staying by her when the rest of the world walked away." Keanu visited Arthur that evening. He found him in his usual place, seated quietly at the grave, a folded copy of the paper resting on his lap. His fingers had worn soft creases into the article. Arthur didn't say anything for a long time. Then, at last, his voice came. "People used to cross the street when they saw me. Now, they leave flowers." Keanu sat beside him. "I think they see you now." Arthur nodded, eyes glassy. "I didn't wait for them, I waited for her. But I'm grateful." Later that week, a bench was installed near the grave, a bronze plaque on its side read, "For the one who stayed, for the one who never needed proof to believe." Arthur didn't sit on it right away. He said it wasn't for him, it was for the people who never knew Elena, but felt what she meant to him, for the ones who came and sat in silence and walked away changed. Keanu left the cemetery with one final request from Arthur. "Don't let the world remember me for how I lived after her. Help them remember how I loved her, before everything else got in the way." Keanu promised he would, and this time there was nothing left to bury, only a truth that had finally seen the light. The cemetery was quieter than usual that evening, not silent but still. Like the world was holding its breath just a little longer for the man who had spent 15 years breathing beside grief. Keanu returned, not to bring news or papers or company. This time he came because Arthur had asked him to. They sat by the grave without words for nearly 20 minutes. The sky was a watercolor wash of violet and blue, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass and stone. Then Arthur spoke. "I've never told anyone what happened that night," he said. Keanu didn't reply, he just waited. Arthur looked down at his hands. It was raining, not hard, just that misty kind that sits on your shoulders. Elena loved it, said it made the world feel softer. He exhaled. "We were walking home from the theater, she'd picked the movie. A romantic drama. She cried during the ending, said it reminded her of when we first met. We were laughing about how bad the popcorn was when I heard the engine." Arthur paused as if the sound still lived in his ears. It came fast, a silver sedan, jumped the curb before I could think. He clenched his fists gently, holding something invisible. I pushed her. I remember that part clear as day. I pushed her out of the way. But the car didn't stop. It clipped the side of the lamppost, skidded, and caught her anyway. Just enough. Just enough to end everything. Keanu felt the stillness settle like fog. I don't remember hitting the ground, Arthur continued. Only waking up with my cheek on the pavement. Her hand was near mine, and the sound of sirens. That's all. They said I was drunk, said I got angry, hit her, and ran her into traffic, said there were bruises on her arms. His voice cracked. But those bruises were mine, from where I grabbed her, from where I tried to save her. Keanu's chest tightened. No one asked me what happened, not once. They just handed me a jacket and told me I wasn't under arrest. Yet, they said it was under investigation. But I knew what that meant. Arthur finally looked up. And the worst part? I believed them. For a while. I thought maybe I failed her. Maybe I didn't do enough. Maybe saving her wasn't possible. He shook his head slowly. But then I came here. And I stayed. Because if I couldn't save her, I could at least make sure no one forgot who she was. Keanu swallowed the lump in his throat. They won't, he said. Not anymore. Arthur leaned back slightly against the bench, his gaze drifting upward as if searching for something just out of reach. The sky had begun to dim. Streetlights flickered on in the distance. But neither man moved. She always said she wanted to grow old in a house with a crooked porch, Arthur said quietly. Said she'd sit there and knit sweaters we'd never wear, just to give them away to neighbors who never asked. Keanu smiled faintly. That sounds like her. Arthur gave the smallest nod. She wasn't fancy, but she was honest. Too honest to survive in a world like that. A world where a man with a last name worth money could vanish into smoke and leave the rest of us choking on his exhaust. He looked down at the ground. They told me to go home, that they'd be in touch. But I didn't have a home left. We'd just moved into a rental, and after she died, they wouldn't renew the lease. Keanu's eyes narrowed. They said I made the neighbors uncomfortable, said it wasn't a good fit for the community. That's when I knew. My name was already tarnished. Arthur took a slow breath, voice low and measured. The whispers started after the funeral. Did you hear? He used to drink. I saw them arguing once. That's all it takes, just enough doubt to erase everything else. He paused, fingers gently tracing the edge of the bench. I tried staying at shelters, but I couldn't sleep. Couldn't be around people who looked at me like I didn't belong anywhere. So I came here. Figured if I was going to be invisible, I'd rather be invisible somewhere near her. He pointed softly at the stone. For a long time, I didn't speak. Didn't want to. I just sat. Let the seasons pass like pages I wasn't ready to read. Winters were hardest, not for the cold, but because that's when her birthday was, January 12th. She used to say the world always forgot, buried beneath snow and silence. Keanu looked at him with a quiet ache. But you didn't forget. Arthur shook his head. I couldn't. She was the only part of the world that ever made sense. They sat in silence a while longer before Arthur finally added, You know what no one ever asked me? Keanu turned toward him. What? Why I stayed. Keanu waited. Arthur closed his eyes. Because she never ran? The next morning, Keanu woke before dawn. He didn't check his phone. He didn't scroll through headlines. He just sat by the window, thinking about Arthur's voice. Soft, clear, and bruised with years of silence. The words still rang in his ears. Because she never ran. It was the kind of line that stays, the kind that settles into the corners of your chest and waits for the right moment to move. Keanu poured himself a cup of coffee and walked over to his desk. He didn't know exactly what he was writing, but the pen moved anyway. He wrote Elena's name. He wrote January 12th, and then he wrote a question. What does a man owe the truth after the world has already moved on? By the time the sun broke over the hills, he had a plan. Later that day, Keanu met with Sophia in the courtyard of their foundation's community hall. He spread out a small stack of notes and photos, images Joan had provided, a snapshot of Arthur and Elena on their wedding day, a copy of the reprinted article, and one single flower taped to a page of handwritten music with Elena's name in the margin. "We're going to hold a ceremony," he said. Sophia looked up. "For her?" "For both of them," Keanu answered, "but especially for the part of her story that never got told." Sophia nodded. "Private?" "No," he said, "public, but not loud, dignified, the way she lived." He called Clara Mendoza from the Pasadena Sentinel. "We're doing something, one time only, just make sure people know why it matters." She agreed. That afternoon, Keanu returned to the cemetery. Arthur was there, as always. The newspaper rested on his knees again, worn now from many readings. Keanu crouched beside him. "There's going to be a gathering here in 2 weeks." Arthur looked over, wary. "You don't have to speak," Keanu said, "or even stand, unless you want to, but people are going to come, to hear her name, to see her story for what it really was." Arthur stared at the ground. Then, softly, "Will there be music?" Keanu smiled. "There will." Arthur looked away for a moment, then whispered, "She always liked strings, never wanted an orchestra, just a quartet." Keanu nodded. "Then, that's what we'll do." And for the first time in years, Arthur let out a breath that sounded like a beginning. Not an ending, not silence, just the soft, slow return of a man stepping out from grief, with love still at his side. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of an old wall clock and the faint sound of wind pressing against the window pane. Keanu sat at his table, a mug of untouched tea beside him, a blank legal pad in front of him, and Arthur's voice echoing in his thoughts. Not the words he spoke, but the ones he never had the space to say aloud. This letter wasn't about headlines, it wasn't for fame, it was for closure. For a man who had waited 15 years to be heard and never once raised his voice. Keanu uncapped a pen and began to write, slowly, carefully. "My name is Arthur Thornton. I am a former U.S. Marine, a widower, and for the last 15 years I've spent each night beside the same grave, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I had nowhere else I wanted to be." He paused. "You don't know me, but I know silence. I know how loud it gets when the world decides your story is over before you've had the chance to speak it." He wrote about Elena, not just the day they met, but the quiet gestures that made her unforgettable. How she hummed old jazz songs when she cooked, how she marked every book she read with a pressed wildflower from the front yard, how she said the world could always be softened by kindness. Then came the night. We were walking home from a movie, laughing about the ending. I heard the engine before I saw the car. I pushed her. It wasn't enough. Keanu swallowed hard. The ink on the page seemed heavier now. They said I was angry. They said I was drunk. They said I was guilty. But no one ever asked me what I remembered. No one ever asked what I lost. They just handed me my silence, and I've carried it ever since. He sat back for a moment, listening to the weight of those lines. Then he continued. But I wasn't staying by that grave because I was broken. I stayed because I was whole once, with her, and I wanted the world to know what that looked like. He ended it with a truth so simple, it barely needed ink. They'd buried my wife, but they never buried my love for her. And that's why I stayed. Keanu read it twice before folding it gently and placing it in an envelope. He signed it himself. He signed it. Arthur Thornton, husband, veteran, witness. The next morning it ran in the Pasadena Sentinel under the headline, "A Letter from the Cemetery, One Man's Vigil for the Truth." By 10 o'clock a.m. the website had crashed from too much traffic. By noon the first bouquet arrived. It was simple, just 3 white roses wrapped in newspaper, left beside the grave with a hand-scrawled note tucked between the stems. It read, "You waited. We're sorry we didn't." By sundown, the grass around Elena's grave was covered. Flowers, candles, small flags, letters written on coffee filters, napkins, even notebook paper torn from the margins of grocery lists. Some people knelt and whispered. Others stood in silence and just nodded at Arthur if he looked their way. Arthur never moved from his usual place, but something had shifted in his posture. His shoulders not so hunched, his spine not quite folded into itself. The letter had done what 15 years of presence never could. It made the invisible visible. News crews arrived the next morning, but Keanu's team had already placed a wooden sign at the edge of the cemetery path. "This is not a site of scandal. It is a site of memory. Please honor it with silence." Still, the story spread. National outlets picked it up. Veterans groups posted tributes. Widows wrote in. One comment on the Sentinel's website read, "My husband died overseas. No one talks about the men who came home and lost everything else. Thank you for showing us one." Even children responded. A third-grade class from San Diego mailed in drawings. One showed a man holding a candle beside a grave. The caption underneath said, "He kept the light on." Arthur noticed. Of course he did. He never asked for any of it. He didn't speak in interviews. He didn't pose for photos. But when Keanu came to sit beside him 3 days after the letter was published, Arthur held out a small envelope without saying a word. Inside was a short note. "I didn't expect people to listen, but I think she would have smiled." That afternoon, a group of veterans arrived, some in uniform, most in denim and baseball caps. One sat beside Arthur, another stood at attention. They didn't need introductions. They simply formed a semicircle around the grave and stayed there for half an hour. No speeches, just presence, just like Arthur. And when the last one turned to leave, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a single dog tag, and placed it beside the gravestone. For a long time, no one touched it, because some symbols are too sacred to move. By the end of the week, the mayor's office issued a statement. It was brief but respectful. Sometimes justice is delayed, but dignity should never be. The city announced it would host a memorial vigil at the cemetery, open to the public, with the family's blessing. Keanu ensured Arthur had the final say. When asked if he wanted to speak, Arthur gave a small shake of the head. Then, after a pause, he murmured, "Maybe just a sentence." Sophia arranged the logistics: simple lighting, a quiet space for people to gather, and a string quartet to play Elena's favorite piece. The cemetery gates were left open late that night. For the first time in decades, hundreds came. Some walked quietly along the headstones, others stopped and knelt before Elena's. Keanu stood near the back, watching, his hands folded in front of him. Arthur sat at the edge of the gathering, wearing a borrowed coat, the corners of his eyes reflecting candlelight. When it was time, Keanu stepped up, not to give a speech, but to introduce the man who had spent 15 years showing the world what love looked like in its most undemanding form. Arthur stood, slowly, gently, as if unsure whether he was allowed. He stepped toward the microphone, then paused, scanning the faces. He didn't need notes. He didn't need applause. His voice, though weathered, was steady. "I loved her," he said. And that was it. He stepped back, sat down, and didn't say another word. But he didn't have to. People clapped softly, not to celebrate him, but to affirm that they heard him, that he wasn't alone anymore, that his silence had always spoken louder than they'd known. After the vigil, several people lingered. They didn't want autographs or photos. They wanted to thank him. For his letter, for his patience, for not giving up. Someone brought a candle in a mason jar with a tag attached. "Thank you for teaching us how to wait." Arthur didn't take credit. He never would. But for the first time in 15 years, he walked out of the cemetery gates, just ahead of Keanu. Not because he was done, but because he knew now he had told the world what mattered. And they had listened. 3 days after the vigil, the letter appeared. Not in the headlines, not on the evening news, but nestled quietly in the Sunday opinion section of the Pasadena Sentinel. The byline was short, but the words beneath it carried decades of weight. From Thomas Thornton, brother of Elena Marie Thornton. I was wrong. That's how it began. The rest of the letter unfolded with deliberate honesty, the kind that only comes from years of silence and the courage to finally break it. I thought I was protecting my sister. When she married Arthur, I let my anger speak louder than my understanding. After she died, I gave a statement that painted him as violent. I told myself I was doing what a brother should do, but I wasn't. I was punishing someone for loving her when I hadn't yet learned how to let her go. Arthur, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. You didn't just lose Elena, you lost your home, your name, your dignity, because of what I said. And I live with that. I hope, someday, you won't have to. The letter was signed, Thomas Thornton, brother, witness, late but not blind. Keanu read it alone in his living room, then quietly folded the page and drove it straight to the cemetery. He didn't announce himself, just sat beside Arthur on the stone bench under the sycamore and placed the letter in his hands. Arthur read the first line, then the second. Then he folded it in half and let it rest in his lap. He didn't speak for almost a minute. When he did, his voice didn't tremble. I never hated him, he said. Keanu tilted his head. Most people would have. Arthur gave a slow shake of his head. Hate burns too fast. I had to last. That same day, Keanu called Sophia and told her to go ahead with the plaque. It had been designed weeks earlier, but Arthur had insisted they wait. Now, he nodded when shown the final draft. She was loved, and he never left. The next morning, Thomas called. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He asked for a seat at the dedication ceremony. Arthur said yes, not because he owed Thomas that seat, but because Elena would have given it. The sun was still low when the first folding chairs were placed in the cemetery. This time, there were no headlines, no reporters. Keanu had made sure of that. This wasn't a spectacle. It was a service, an acknowledgement that some truths arrive late, but they still deserve a place to land. A small speaker played Elena's favorite melody, a string quartet piece she used to hum while setting the table, Arthur once said. The same piece played at their wedding, the same one she asked him to learn on harmonica, even though he never got past the first 3 notes. The guests arrived slowly. Veterans in jackets, neighbors who used to cross the street, a few former police officers, and Thomas. He stood alone, dressed in a modest gray suit, holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. His steps were hesitant. He glanced at Arthur once before the ceremony began. Arthur nodded, just once. And Thomas lowered his gaze, but didn't walk away. When Keanu took the microphone, he didn't make a speech. He simply introduced Arthur as a man who waited long enough, and Thomas as a man who finally showed up. Then he stepped aside. Thomas stood, trembling slightly, but he didn't unfold the paper. He looked at the small brass plaque beside the gravestone, its lettering now polished, the words catching sunlight like gold. She was loved, and he never left. He took a breath. I was wrong, he said. And for most of my life, I tried to convince myself I wasn't. He glanced toward Arthur, who sat quietly beside the grave, hands folded. I loved my sister deeply, Thomas continued, but I didn't understand her choice. I didn't understand Arthur, and I let that ignorance become cruelty. I made a statement I never should have made. I buried more than a body. I buried a man's life. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. I can't ask for forgiveness. I can only say this. You loved her better than I understood, and you kept showing up. That's more than most of us ever do. Then he stepped back, eyes down, and returned to his seat. There was no applause, just stillness. Arthur didn't rise, didn't speak. He only reached out, placed a hand over the plaque beside him, and gave a small nod in Thomas's direction. It wasn't loud, but everyone saw it. and somehow that made it louder than anything he could have said. The days following the ceremony were quiet. Arthur returned to the cemetery, but something in his rhythm changed. He no longer arrived right at dusk. Sometimes he came mid-morning. Sometimes he sat not beside the grave, but at the edge of the field, watching the sunlight move across the stones. And the coat he used to wrap around himself like armor? It stayed folded at his side. The plaque had been set, the ground around it had settled, and though no great crowd came to see it, visitors arrived in twos and threes, some bringing flowers, others just tracing the engraved words with their fingers. One child brought a small paper heart and left it near the stone. It read, in uneven handwriting, "I hope you sleep warm now." One afternoon, Keanu returned with something in his hand, a sealed envelope, mailed from a city clerk's office. "Thought you should open it," he said. Arthur turned it over. The seal was official, the envelope thick. He broke it open slowly. Inside, a notarized letter. Official certification from the Office of Historical Records, affirming an amendment to the city's public archive. On record, we now recognize Arthur Thornton as the surviving husband of Elena Marie Thornton. Any prior implication of wrongdoing has been removed and struck from public summary. Arthur read the line 3 times. No one cheered, no music played, but the weight that had lived in his shoulders year after year, snowfall after snowfall, didn't return when he folded the letter. Instead, he passed it to Keanu and said, "I don't need it." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Arthur nodded. "I just needed it written, not kept." A week later, Keanu donated the letter to the same local library that now kept a digital archive of Pasadena's most meaningful community stories. He asked that it be stored without fanfare, just a simple label. Proof that silence isn't always the end. When Sophia told Arthur, he smiled faintly. "Good," he said, "because for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm standing at the end of something." He stood up that day and walked home instead of sleeping beneath the sycamore. And though he returned often, he came with flowers now. Not to mourn, but to remember. And that, more than any speech, any plaque, any rewritten headline, was what forgiveness finally looked like. The evening after the ceremony, Keanu sat at his desk, rereading the closing words of Arthur's public letter, the same way he had read them the first time. Slowly, deliberately, letting them settle. I waited, not because I thought the world would listen, but because I knew she would have. That line stayed with him. It wasn't about revenge or recognition. It wasn't even about healing. It was about loyalty, unshakable, unrewarded, and real. And in a world that so often forgets what love looks like when no one's watching, that was worth asking about. So, Keanu posted a simple message from his Foundations page. Have you ever held on to something out of love, even when the world told you to let go? Share below. Heed that he didn't use Arthur's name. He didn't include the cemetery photo. No hashtags, no filters. Just the question, resting like a stone in still water. It didn't take long. The first comment came from a woman named Janice, whose husband died in Afghanistan 17 years earlier. She wrote, "I still keep his boots by the front door. Everyone said I should pack them away, but sometimes I come home late and imagine he's just out back. I know it's silly. But love doesn't go where it's told." Another came from a man named Roger, who lost his daughter to cancer at age 12. "She had a favorite spoon. It's still in the drawer. I use it every morning. People think I should let go, but it's how I hold on." And then, one after another, the flood began. Spouses, parents, siblings, even strangers. Some had lost loved ones to illness, others to war, a few to prison, others to addiction, and some simply to time. A former prison warden shared this. "I saw men hold on to family photos so long the faces faded. I used to think it was sad. Now I think it was sacred." An elderly woman in Boston said she still walked to the bakery her husband used to love, even though he'd passed away 5 years ago. That'll don't have his favorite bread anymore. But I still go, because that smell reminds me that I had someone worth remembering. The post went viral in hours, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet, and it touched the part of people that didn't need fixing, just acknowledging. By the end of the first week, the post had over 42,000 shares. But what mattered more than the numbers were the stories. They began arriving in handwritten letters, emails, and even drawings. Some people didn't have words, only sketches, of holding hands, of empty chairs, of gravestones surrounded by flowers. One child sent a crayon drawing of a man sleeping beside a heart-shaped rock with a caption that simply read, "He never gave up." A teacher from Minnesota wrote that her high school students read the post aloud during class. They went around the room and shared something they'd each held onto, an old voicemail, a jacket, a story. One girl, usually silent, stood up and said, "I thought only weirdos kept things. Now I think maybe we're the ones who know what love feels like." Arthur didn't see all of it, not right away, but Keanu would bring a few each morning, sometimes just one folded letter, other times a stack. Arthur would read them slowly, hands trembling, and then place each one inside a small wooden box Sophia had given him. On the lid, she'd written in black ink, "For the ones who remember." Then came the visits. Not crowds, not influencers, just people. An elderly couple who had driven 5 hours from out of state brought fresh flowers for Elena's grave. They had lost their son decades ago and said they wanted to say thank you to someone who had stayed behind for love. A young Marine on leave stopped by with his father. He didn't speak much, just stood at the grave, saluted, and left a challenge coin on the stone. Another woman came with a small bag of birdseed. She said Elena had once taught her music as a child, and that she remembered her laugh better than her own mother's voice. "This was her husband?" she asked Keanu gently. "She picked a good one." Arthur never said much to the visitors, but he stood more often now. He shook hands, he offered his chair, and when someone asked if he minded all the attention, he gave a tired smile and said, "It's not about me. It's about what we all still believe." Sophia had an idea one morning, and it started with a wall. She printed out the top 200 comments from Keanu's post, stories of grief, of memory, of small and sacred rituals, and began tacking them to a long wooden panel in the foundation's meeting room. But as the days passed, the paper kept coming. Letters, art, names. By the end of the second week, it had spilled across 2 walls, then 3. By the third week, they had to rent a small annex space nearby and name it simply The Wall of Holding On. Visitors were allowed to walk through, read any note, and leave one of their own. They didn't curate it, they didn't sanitize it, they just let it live. And it did. People wrote about lost spouses, pets, dreams, children they gave up for adoption, parents they'd never met. One woman wrote only a date and the word "still here." Someone else taped a faded ticket stub next to a quote from their father, "We'll see it again together someday." Veterans came, widows came, runaways, retired nurses, even strangers who said they didn't understand what drew them, just that they felt they needed to stand in that space. One wall was eventually dedicated to drawings, another to objects, a paperclip chain, a bookmark, a ribbon, even a single spoon. Everything meant something. Everything had been held for a reason. Keanu visited the wall alone one night, long after the lights were off. He didn't touch anything, he just stood in the center and listened to the silence between the stories. The air wasn't sad, it was full, weighted, but not heavy. He noticed a new note pinned to the top right corner of the wall. It hadn't been there earlier that day. It read, "To the man who slept by her side, thank you for reminding me that love is not fragile. It's persistent. Signed, no name, just grateful." A few days later, a new visitor came to Arthur's bench. She didn't introduce herself. She simply sat quietly beside him, then placed her hand over her heart and whispered, He waited for me too. Arthur didn't ask who. He just nodded, and they watched the sun fall through the trees together. Sometimes that was enough, because grief shared wasn't lighter. It was just less lonely. And in a world where love was often measured by how loud it shouted, Arthur had reminded them all that sometimes the deepest devotion was the kind that never left, even when everyone else had. Arthur didn't want to leave the cemetery. Even after the public apology, the viral story, the letters, the visitors, he still returned every evening, sitting on the bench like a man who had no other address. And in a way, he didn't. The trees had become his roof, the roots his carpet, Elena's grave his compass. So when Keanu brought up the idea of moving, Arthur shook his head before the sentence even ended. "I'm not leaving her," he said plainly. Keanu didn't argue. Instead, he came back the next day with Sophia and a map. It was drawn on soft parchment, sketched by hand, with notes in careful cursive along the borders. "It's not a shelter," Keanu said gently. "It's a home, for veterans, quiet, private, no press, and there's a memorial garden." Arthur looked at the map but said nothing. Keanu pointed to a small shaded patch in the corner. "This is where they place markers, for spouses. Elena's name could be there. You'd visit her every day, sit by her in the sun, not the frost." Still, Arthur didn't respond. So Keanu left the map folded in his lap and walked away. 2 days passed before Arthur spoke about it again. When Keanu came with breakfast, Arthur was already up, the folded map in his coat pocket. "If I go," he said slowly, "will she?" Keanu nodded. "She already is." It took another week to arrange everything. The home had a waiting list, but one call was enough. Not because it came from someone famous, but because it came with something rarer, a story already known, and a man the staff respected before they ever met him. Arthur? Didn't take much. Just the letters, the box, a framed photo of Elena, her wedding ring, which he still wore on a leather cord. Keanu drove him on a Sunday morning. Sophia had already set up the room, nothing flashy, just warm. A quilted blanket, a bookshelf, a small music player. The window looked out toward the east, where the violets would soon bloom. When they arrived, Arthur stood at the edge of the garden before stepping inside. He looked around slowly, taking it in like a soldier returning from a long patrol, unsure if the war was truly over. Then he said, "She'd like the quiet here." Keanu replied, "She always did." And Arthur stepped forward, not to say goodbye, but to begin again. At first, Arthur sat alone. He spent the mornings on the porch, a quiet figure with his coat draped over his shoulders even when the air warmed. He spoke little, just nodded at other veterans passing by with coffee or canes. Some recognized him, a few offered a hand, most just offered space. But every Sunday, without fail, Keanu came. No camera crews, no announcements, just a walk through the gate, a bag of fresh violets in hand, and a few minutes beside Arthur as they planted a new patch together. "She liked these," Arthur said once, kneeling carefully beside the soft earth. Said they were humble, like little secrets you had to lean down to appreciate. Keanu smiled, pressing one into the soil. "Sounds like her." Arthur didn't reply right away. Then he said softly, "She wasn't the kind of person you needed to explain, just the kind you didn't forget." Some Sundays they spoke for hours. Other times barely a word passed between them. But something always grew. A little more ground softened. A little more root took hold. Sophia visited once with a thermos of tea. She brought a bench cushion stitched with Elena's name in fine thread and left it by Arthur's chair. He didn't speak then, just touched the edge of the cushion like it was glass, then quietly placed it beneath him. One morning, a small group of school children came through the garden on a community visit. Their guide spoke about the memorial plots, the way the violets had become a symbol for remembrance. One child, no older than 8, raised her hand. "Who planted all the purple flowers?" Arthur looked down, a little startled. The guide turned toward him, unsure how to respond. Keanu stepped forward. "He did," he said gently, "for someone he loved." The child nodded solemnly, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. After that visit, others began asking about the flowers. Some residents added their own. One man planted marigolds, another brought roses. But the violets, those stayed Arthur's. His patch grew like a quiet hymn, lining the path where the morning light touched first. Arthur no longer needed to sleep in the cold. But each morning he still rose before the sun, walked out to the garden, and sat beside her marker. Not because he didn't know where home was, but because she had been it. The director of the housing program noticed something unusual by the third month. New residents were asking to visit the memorial garden before they unpacked their bags. Some even brought a flower with them, freshly cut or wild from the roadside. When asked why, most simply said the same thing. "We heard about the man who planted violets." Arthur never asked for that kind of attention. If anything, he tried to deflect it. But the violets had taken on a life of their own. Families came to walk the path, strangers came to sit quietly nearby, and the veterans? They watched him, not as a man broken by time, but as someone who had survived it with love intact. One afternoon, Keanu arrived early. He carried something wrapped in soft linen. Arthur stood slowly from his bench, brushing off his hands from the dirt. "I didn't bring flowers," Keanu said. "Not today." Arthur tilted his head. Then what? Keanu unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small bronze plaque no larger than a book cover. The engraving read, "Elena Marie Thornton, beloved nurse, devoted wife. Her strength lives in violets." Arthur didn't speak. He just ran a hand over the plaque, as if reading it through the skin. "We got approval," Keanu said. "It'll go beside her marker, so people will know." Arthur looked up. "I didn't need the world to know." "I know," Keanu said. "But she deserved it." They installed it together that evening, just as the sun dipped low behind the hedges. Keanu used a small trowel. Arthur steadied the stone. When they were finished, they didn't say much, just stood there, shoulder to shoulder. Later that night, Arthur sat on the edge of his bed, holding one of Elena's letters, the same one she'd written before her final nursing assignment overseas, where they first met. It had yellowed with time, but the ink still whispered her voice. At the bottom, her final line read, "Wherever you are, find something to grow, and when you do, you'll find me." He folded the letter back and looked out the window. The moon hung above the garden, pale and still. The violets below caught the light just enough to glow. Arthur lay back and let the silence come. Not heavy this time, but full. Like a blanket he didn't have to clutch anymore. In the morning he would rise early, plant something new, and sit beside her again. Not because he was waiting, but because love, once real, never truly leaves. It started with a broom. No ceremony, no permission. Just Arthur showing up one morning after breakfast with a soft bristled broom and a rag in his back pocket. He didn't ask the groundskeeper, he just began. First, he cleaned the moss from the headstones nearest the violet patch. Quietly, carefully, one name at a time. Then he moved to the walkways, picked up leaves, trimmed edges where grass had begun to crawl over the stone. By the second week, others noticed. Staff members nodded. A few volunteers tried to join him, but Arthur never asked for help. He didn't mind them being there, he just kept moving, slow and steady. Some days it was 20 steps, some days a full row. But he always circled back to Elena's marker before going home. Keanu noticed the change immediately. "You've made it a habit," he said one Sunday. Arthur shrugged. "It gives me something to do with the ache." He didn't mean it poetically, it was just the truth. That ache, the quiet hum that lived beneath the ribs, never really left. But work made it quieter, not because it distracted him, but because it gave the ache a place to land. A few weeks later, someone from the local veteran services team dropped by. They had heard about the violets, about the garden, about the man who stayed. That's what they called him, the Quiet Keeper. Arthur didn't correct them. He just nodded and offered them tea. The name stuck. Residents started referring to him that way, not out of mockery, but respect. He became the unofficial guide for new arrivals. When a man from Michigan arrived and stood frozen in the garden, unsure how to visit his late wife's marker, it was Arthur who walked beside him. "She's still listening," he said simply. "Just talk like you used to." That moment became legend among the staff. Soon they began bringing Arthur small things. A new kneeling mat, a set of soft gardening gloves, a plaque with a carved violet and his nickname beneath it. He didn't want the attention, but he accepted the gifts the way one accepts kindness. Without argument, without flourish, and still, every Sunday, sometimes to work beside him, sometimes to just sit. "I think they needed you here," Keanu said once. Arthur replied, "No, I just never left." And somehow, that made all the difference. Word traveled further than anyone expected. A local journalist wrote a small piece in the weekend column, barely 300 words, about the man who tended violets in a memorial garden for his late wife. No name was mentioned, just the story. A story about waiting, love, and what it meant to show up when no one asked you to. That single column was shared more than 20,000 times in a week. Within a month, veterans from across the region began visiting the garden, not for photos, not for interviews, but to sit. Some sat for 10 minutes, others stayed the afternoon. A few brought flowers. One man brought his dog. Another brought a trumpet and played taps at dusk, once a week, without saying a word. Arthur didn't organize it. He didn't schedule it, but people came anyway. One afternoon, Keanu arrived to find a half section of chairs placed in a shaded area of the garden. 10 men sat in quiet conversation, all in various stages of loss. One had just buried his brother. Another hadn't spoken since his son died. They didn't trade advice. They didn't even always share stories. They just gathered. Arthur stood a few feet away, broom in hand. He wasn't in the circle, but they all glanced toward him when he passed. He nodded once, and they nodded back. That was enough. Later, a staff member asked Arthur if he wanted to lead a grief group, organize something formal. He politely declined. "They don't need a leader," he said. "They just need a place." So the place remained, quiet, open, sacred in its simplicity. And Arthur kept showing up. The youngest veteran in the home, a man named Jacob, began walking with Arthur each morning. At first, he only followed a few steps behind. Then, one day, he picked up a rake and joined him. Arthur didn't say anything, but he handed him a pair of gloves. 2 days later, Jacob asked if they could replant a section of the garden near the east wall. "For who?" Arthur asked. Jacob hesitated. "For someone I didn't get to say goodbye to." Arthur nodded. "Then let's make it beautiful." By the end of the week, the violets were joined by goldenrod and white lilacs, and the east wall began to bloom. Autumn arrived gently that year. The garden, once rich with violets and summer bloom, began to pale around the edges. Leaves curled into reds and golds, crunching softly beneath visitors' feet. The benches were no longer full every day, but the spirit of the place remained. Arthur still came out each morning, now wrapped in an old navy blue scarf. His gait was slower, but his eyes were steady, and if he ever forgot which patch he'd tended, his hands remembered. One Sunday, Keanu sat beside him longer than usual. The wind carried the faint scent of earth and pine. "She would have loved this season," Keanu said. Arthur smiled faintly. "She always said fall was God's exhale." They sat in silence, watching the wind comb the grass. Then Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook, leather-bound, worn and tied with twine. He handed it to Keanu. "What is it?" Keanu asked. "Stories," Arthur said. "Not mine. Theirs. The ones who sat in the circle. The ones who couldn't speak but came anyway." Keanu opened it slowly. Each page was filled with careful penmanship. No names, just memories. Messages to wives, sons, comrades, confessions of guilt, hopes whispered between grief and grace. At the back of the notebook was a folded sheet of paper. Arthur looked away. "That one's mine." Keanu read it silently, just a few sentences written in a steady hand. "I stayed because I didn't know what else to do. I stayed because leaving meant forgetting. But now I stay because others showed up. And somehow, that made it sacred." A week later, with the help of Sophia and the Veteran Homes Board, Keanu arranged to have the final page engraved, word for word, onto a plaque installed at the garden entrance. It read simply, "The man who stayed and made room for all who couldn't." Arthur never commented on it. He just paused slightly longer at the gate when passing by. The name Quiet Keeper never left him, not because he wanted it, but because it was earned. And every morning he returned to the garden, not out of duty, not out of habit, but because love, when lived fully, becomes a path others can walk. And he had cleared it well. The morning was quiet when Keanu returned. No cameras, no press, just the rustle of early autumn wind through the branches that hung low over the memorial garden. He walked alone down the gravel path, familiar beneath his steps, until the violet patch came into view. It had grown wider since his last visit. Golden blooms lined the outer edges now, and in the center stood the grave he had once found, nearly forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten now. It was surrounded by small tokens, drawings from children, hand-folded paper cranes, a tiny marine figurine resting at the base. Someone had left a violin pin. Another had left a copy of a handwritten poem sealed in plastic. And flowers, dozens of them. Wild ones. Bouquets. Some placed carefully, others scattered as if tossed in quiet reverence. Keanu stood there in silence. What was once a single headstone had become a place of stillness, a sanctuary, not just for grief, but for something deeper. Recognition, respect, remembrance without demand. He stepped closer and read the engraving. The original inscription was still there, Elena Marie Thornt, my always. But beneath it, a new line had been etched in soft gold. To those who stayed when no one was watching. Keanu placed his hand gently over the stone. There was no plaque naming Arthur, no mention of the garden, just a message that now belonged to anyone who understood it. A few yards away, a small bench had been added beneath the elm tree. 2 children were sitting there, eating a packed lunch. Their mother stood behind them, eyes fixed on the grave. She wasn't crying, just watching, like it meant something, like someone she loved had taught her why it should. Keanu stepped aside to let them have the space. As he stood near the tree line, a familiar figure approached. Jacob, the younger veteran who had helped plant the goldenrod near the east wall. "Did you know him?" Jacob asked. Keanu nodded. "I did." "Help me plant the flowers over there," Jacob said, pointing to the newer patch. "Didn't say much, but he made me want to say something to someone." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's how you know it mattered." They stood in silence for a while, just long enough for the wind to pick up again and scatter a few petals across the grass like a soft answer. After Jacob left, Keanu lingered. He bent to clear away a few fallen petals from the base of Elena's grave and noticed something different. The edge of the stone had been polished recently. The soil near the front looked disturbed, not in a careless way, but gently turned, as if someone had been planting something small. Curious, he reached beneath the lip of the stone where the granite slightly overhung the dirt and felt the edge of a thin, smooth object wrapped in wax paper. Carefully, he pulled it free. It was a sealed envelope. A name was scrawled across the front in trembling script, "To the man who stayed." Keanu looked around. No one was watching. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, yellowed at the edges, the handwriting unsteady but deliberate. The ink wavered in places, as though the writer had paused often. He began reading. "If you're reading this, it means you listened. Not just to me, but to what I couldn't say aloud. I never asked for forgiveness, not from the world. But I hoped someone would understand that I stayed not because I was stuck, but because leaving meant she'd be alone. And I couldn't do that to her, even if I had nothing left to give. Keanu's throat tightened. You see, people often think grief is a cage, but it's not. Not always. Sometimes it's a vigil, a flame you keep lit, not to burn the past, but to honor that it ever gave you warmth in the first place. I never cared if the world remembered me, but I do hope they remember her. The way her hand trembled when she laughed, the way she left notes in my lunch, the way she hummed to the radio while folding towels. She was soft, and I was sharp, but somehow we made music. Keanu closed his eyes, letting the words settle like dust in quiet sun. The letter continued. So if you see someone who lingers in silence, don't ask them to move on. Ask them what they're remembering. Ask them what stayed. Because love doesn't always look like flowers and vows. Sometimes it looks like a coat pulled tighter on a bench in the rain. At the bottom of the letter was no signature. Just 3 words. Still beside her, Keanu folded the page slowly, then pressed it to his chest, standing completely still as the wind moved again through the trees. Keanu didn't keep the letter. He brought it to the garden staff the next day and asked if there was a way to preserve it, not behind glass, but close to the earth where it belonged. They agreed. Together, they placed it in a small, weather-sealed capsule, wrapped in linen and tied with a violet ribbon. Then, beneath the bench where Jacob often sat, they carved a shallow recess, gently sliding the capsule inside. A small metal plate was fixed above it. It read, "A letter for the listener. Open only if you need to stay." It wasn't a headline, it wasn't a statue, but it was enough. A week later, Keanu returned once more, this time at dusk. The garden was empty, save for a small boy standing near the east wall, looking up at the engraved quote above the archway. He couldn't have been older than 10. He had a small notebook clutched to his chest. Keanu approached slowly. "You okay?" The boy nodded. "I saw the man on TV. The one who stayed. Is this where he loved her?" Keanu's voice softened. "Yeah, this is the place." The boy looked down. "My grandma died this year. I didn't know where to go. My mom said I could come here to think." Keanu knelt beside him. "That's a good place to start." The boy was quiet a moment, then asked, "Did he ever stop being sad?" Keanu paused. "No," he said, "but he stopped being alone." The boy nodded, then pulled a folded drawing from his notebook. It was of a bench beneath a tree, with 2 stick figures holding hands under a sky full of stars. He placed it beside the plaque and stepped back. "She likes stars," the boy said. "I think he did too." Keanu smiled. "I think you're right." As the boy walked away to rejoin his mother at the gate, Keanu stood once more beside Elena's grave. The petals had drifted into the stone's grooves, catching sunlight in a way that made them shimmer like small flames. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It held voices, now. Not loud, not in chorus, but in harmony. A lingering music of loyalty, the kind that never asks to be heard, but waits to be remembered. Keanu placed one hand gently on the bench, and with his other, he left behind a single white violet. Then he turned and walked back into the evening. The sun had dipped behind the western hills, casting the sky in soft bands of orange and lavender when Arthur made his way up the gravel path one more time. He walked slower now. The cane he refused for years had become a quiet companion, tapping gently beside each footstep. He wore the same threadbare coat he'd had for decades, though it now fit him loosely. Over his arm, folded with care, was the same wool blanket that had once wrapped his knees through bitter winters by Elena's grave. But this night was different. It wasn't grief that brought him back. It was quiet. A kind of stillness that only comes when something that's long been broken is finally mended, if not by the world, then by those few souls who stopped long enough to understand. Arthur paused by the iron gate to the memorial garden. Someone had left a string of small lights woven into the fence. He smiled. He hadn't done that. Someone else had. The garden belonged to more people now. He continued down the path, nodding to a familiar caretaker who tipped his cap but didn't speak. No one did. It wasn't necessary. When he reached the grave, Arthur stopped. The flowers were fresh. The bench had been cleaned. A small folded paper crane rested beside the violet patch, untouched by wind, as if anchored by intention. He set down the blanket and unfolded it beside the headstone. Then, slowly, he lowered himself onto it, not with aching effort but with calm ritual. His knees bent, his back eased to the ground, and he rested his head on the softest corner. Above him, the first stars blinked awake. He let out a long, slow breath, the kind of breath you only take when there's nothing left to guard. For a few minutes, he said nothing. Then, as the cicadas fell quiet and the evening fell still, he turned his face gently toward the stone and whispered, "They finally see you." His voice cracked, but didn't break. "You're not just a name anymore. They know who you were, how you loved, how you listened." He closed his eyes, and now they listened too. The stars shimmered above, unfazed by the world's noise. Arthur lay quietly, his hands folded across his chest, the warmth of the blanket beneath him and the chill of early night brushing his cheeks. It wasn't the cold that made his eyes sting. It was the weight he no longer carried. The burden that had once pressed against his spine, heavy with doubt, had slipped away like mist. For years he had believed he would vanish, with no one the wiser, that the world would forget her name and with it forget him too. But now a boy had left a sketch. A soldier had knelt in silence. A woman had wept, not because she knew Elena, but because she understood. He smiled to himself. That was enough. He turned slightly and looked up at the elm tree, whose leaves now rustled softly overhead. That tree had been sapling thin when he first arrived. He remembered sitting under it the first night after the funeral, unsure if he'd ever stand again. But the tree had stood, and so had he. Arthur's breath was steady now, each inhale slow and deep, as if drawing something more than air. Memory, maybe, or peace. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a photo, worn edges, slightly faded. It showed Elena in her uniform, laughing beside a field tent, wind catching her hair in mid-laugh. He kissed the photo softly, then laid it on his chest. "I never wanted them to see me," he whispered. "I just wanted them to remember you." Above him, the stars blinked again, steadier now, as if listening. Arthur closed his eyes and let his mind drift, not to the past, but to the present, to this one moment, unburdened by proving or defending or surviving. No headlines, no guards, no judgments, just grass beneath him and her name carved into stone above him. And the knowledge that for once someone would remember not how he stayed, but why. He sighed, then chuckled quietly. "Only took me 15 years, he murmured. The night deepened and a gentle breeze moved through the garden like a whisper passed from leaf to leaf. Arthur shifted only slightly, letting the sounds of the world fade into something softer, something sacred. For the first time in many years, he didn't brace against sleep. He didn't resist it. He welcomed it. Not as an escape, but as a kind of surrender, not to pain, not to loneliness, but to the truth that had finally been spoken aloud, that she was seen, that he had not loved in vain. Far off in the city, lights flickered. Somewhere, music played through a half-opened window. But here, in the quiet, the only rhythm was the slow breath of a man who had lived his life with one unwavering vow: to stay. And now, as the sky curved overhead like a shield, Arthur whispered something no one else would hear. "I'll be home soon." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even sad. It was a promise to her, and a peace offering to himself. As dawn crept in, slow and golden, the first birds stirred in the trees. The light touched the tips of the violets that framed the bench, casting long shadows against the grass. A caretaker found him there, curled gently beneath the blanket, the photo of Elena still resting over his heart. The man didn't move. He didn't need to. The groundskeeper didn't panic or call out. He simply lowered his head and placed a hand on the bench. He had seen this coming, just not so gracefully. Later that morning, Keanu arrived. He said nothing at first, just sat beside Arthur, the two of them facing east where the sun now crowned the garden in light. Then he reached into his coat and took out a folded flag, one Arthur had refused to accept for years. He placed it beside him, just so. A note was tucked under it, written days before. It read, "Thank you for remembering her. That's all I ever wanted." That evening, the garden didn't hold a vigil. There was no ceremony, no headline. But dozens came. Some knelt, some stood, some just listened to the silence. The grave didn't speak, but it no longer had to. Because now, the story lived in every person who knew what it meant to wait, to love without applause, to guard memory as a sacred act. Arthur's last night wasn't lonely. It was his gift to her, and to anyone who had ever needed permission to stay. Some people are forgotten because no one stood still long enough to remember them. But some stay, and by staying, they remind us what loyalty really is. Arthur Thornton never asked for recognition. He never carried a sign or told his story loudly. He didn't campaign for justice or plead his innocence with trembling hands. Instead, he stayed. Not out of protest, not even out of pain, but because love, in its truest form, doesn't ask for anything in return. It simply shows up, every day. And in a world that moves faster with every hour, where attention is currency and noise is mistaken for meaning, a man kneeling quietly by a grave became the loudest voice of all. His story didn't end with loss. It ended with legacy. Not because a movie star found him, but because someone listened. Someone paused long enough to ask why he was still there. And once the truth came forward, it didn't matter how long it had taken. What mattered was that it was no longer buried. What Arthur gave to Elena wasn't measured in words or flowers or etched stones. It was presence. It was the quiet refusal to let time erase what mattered. If you've ever had someone stay beside you when no one else did, through storms, silence, or the seasons of being misunderstood, you know how rare that is. Sometimes, we think love is shown in grand gestures or heroic sacrifice. But the purest kind often looks like what Arthur did: a coat on the ground, a quiet vigil, a promise kept, night after night, without anyone watching. Arthur's story asks us one simple question: who have we stayed for? And maybe more importantly, who stayed for us? If someone came to mind, share it with us in the comments. We want to know. Because stories like this don't just belong to the past, they live on in the people who refuse to forget, who choose to remember what others let slip away. Whether it was a parent, a friend, a partner, or a stranger, you matter to someone because they stayed. And you might be someone's Arthur without even knowing it. This video is part of a growing series about unseen devotion, redemptive truth, and the quiet power of presence. If it moved you, subscribe to join this journey, and please share this story. Let it reach someone who needs to feel seen. Next week, we continue. She taught him everything, then vanished. Years later, a violin on a street corner brings the truth back.